Often there are more than one IEEE 1149.1 compliant devices on a unit under test. In order to test connections between boundary scan devices, the test system needs to access the tap signals on those devices. The most common way of working with multiple boundary scan devices on a PCB is through a daisy chain. Boundary scan testing also requires the UT to be powered up, since the boundary scan cells and tap controllers in those devices actually represent a major part of the test system. Let's assume we have two boundary scan devices on the unit under test. The taps of these two devices need to be accessible for the test system, either through a test bus connector or through test points. In order to create a daisy chain, we connect the TDO of the test system to the TDI of the unit under test and to the first device, respectively. Then the TDO of that device is connected to the TDI of the next device. If there were more than two devices, then the TDO of that second device would be connected to the TDI of the next device, and so on. The TDO of the last device in the scan chain would be connected to the TDI of the test system. The other test bus signals, T-clock, TMS, and optional test reset, are connected in parallel to all devices. That way, the tap controllers of all devices in the chain are always in sync. That is, if the scan chain is functioning properly, all devices are in the same tap controller state at any given time. Test vectors can now be delivered to the boundary scan devices through the scan chain. In order to apply test patterns to the devices' I/O pins, the test system would apply scan-DR cycles as discussed in the previous slide. On an actual printed circuit assembly, we have not only boundary scan devices, but also a variety of other types of components, including digital devices such as memories, buffers, transceivers, logic gates, and interface circuitry, as well as power supply and other analog and mixed signal circuitry. There are a number of tests that can be applied with boundary scan as illustrated on this slide. The first type of test that typically is executed anytime someone is running boundary scan tests is a so-called infrastructure test or scan chain integrity test. The infrastructure test verifies that the scan chain is functioning properly and that the correct boundary scan devices are mounted on the printed circuit assembly. If the scan chain does not work properly, there is typically no point in executing any other test since the test vectors couldn't be delivered. The test of connections between boundary scan I/O pins is called Interconnect Test or Connectivity Test. Such interconnect tests often include what we call transparent clusters. The transparent clusters are one or more devices that do not provide boundary scan capabilities, but can be seen as transmitting signals from one pin to another. Examples are unidirectional or bidirectional buffers and bus switches, serial resistors, and even simple logic gates. Connections between a boundary scan device to a memory device, such as an SRAM or DRAM, can be tested as part of a memory cluster test or memory access test. Essentially, certain addresses of the memory are written to with certain data patterns and then read back under control of boundary scan I/O pins connected to the memory's address, data, and control bus. Another type of test is the so-called logic cluster test. Logic clusters are digital functional blocks of non-boundary scan devices that can be stimulated and observed with boundary scan I/O pins connected to the cluster's input and output signals. Glue logic is one example of such clusters. Interface circuitry can be considered another type of cluster. In order to test interface circuits that are connected to boundary scan devices in one side and to peripheral connectors on the other side, additional tester resources would need to be wired to the peripheral connectors. These tester resources can then be used in conjunction with the boundary scan I/O on the UUT to stimulate and observe the interface cluster. In addition to test applications such as those discussed so far, we can also download firmware and other data into programmable devices using the scan chain as a transport medium. For example, we can program CPLD and FPGA devices directly through their test access port. Even serial EEPROM and flash EEPROM can be programmed via boundary scan devices by following the same principles applied for memory cluster tests. We will be discussing boundary scan applications in more detail in another session in this webinar series.